Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hi, I'm Tricia Class. Today I'm talking with Lara Handsfield and Tom Crumpler, professors in the School of Teaching and Learning. They both teach in the literacy area. The article we will discuss today focuses on interactions that occur in a literature discussion group of bilingual students. Welcome, Lara and Tom, and thank you for talking with me.
Thank you for inviting us.
It's great to be here.
I'm glad you can make it on a snowy day. You cited the need to conduct micro-level examinations of classroom practice with language to understand these and their effect on inequity. Can you expand that argument and explain more?
Sure. Particularly in the field of curriculum and instruction, there's often an emphasis on the general approach to literacy instruction. For example, cognitive strategy instruction or literature circles or what have you. But the warrant for micro-level analysis is that really, regardless of what kind of curricular approach you're using, where things really begin to take effect and where you can see different ideologies of language and literacy coming into play is at that micro level. So it's really the kinds of interactions that are happening on the ground in the context of instruction, which we know is quite messy. And that's really where the interesting stuff starts to happen and where we can see identities and ideologies coming into play, being constructed or deconstructed.
And I would just add to that, I think another argument for that kind of analysis is what often seems to us just ordinary, everyday sort of work like literature circles. In a micro-analysis, you really begin to make the familiar strange, if you will, and all sorts of new learnings become visible with that level of analysis.
Just even the phrase seeing red and how much time you devote to just that two words.
Yes.
Right. So, I think it allows us to really look deeply into a small amount of data, but the reward for that is really rich, in-depth analysis.
And I think particularly when you're interested in understanding student and teacher identities or even broader ideologies of language and literacy or teaching and learning, when you take a macro view, it's pretty easy to see different approaches or certain kinds of identities as fairly solidified things. But sort of like if you were to compare it to quantum physics, for example. In quantum physics, at that really, really micro level, things start to break down and things aren't quite so neat and clean as they seem. And so when you take that micro lens, you can really begin to see how there are multiple possible identities being constructed at the same time. Understanding that might help us understand how we can use that to perhaps even change identity trajectories for kids who tend to be marginalized in the classroom.
Next, we should talk about the setting and context for the study. Could you describe what you think are the key elements that people should know about?
This took place in a fourth grade bilingual classroom, and this was a transitional bilingual program. And for people who don't know what that is, the primary institutional goal of such a program is to move children into English as soon as possible and into all English settings. Oftentimes that means at the cost of their native language. The native language is used only insofar as it can get kids to transition into English. That's not necessarily how the teachers who teach within those programs approach every aspect of their work, but that's the general approach that was the institutional designation, if you will, for this classroom.
You know, this was a teacher who we had worked with as part of a Spencer grant, which funded this research, and she is a person who we've actually worked with quite a bit. And what's great about working with this classroom is she's the kind of teacher who is willing to let kids take some risks and puzzle and work some things out for themselves and sort of step back and watch learning happen. And that's been very exciting for us, I think, as researchers to be a part of that.
I think that her tendency and willingness to do that opened up the kinds of spaces that enabled us to document and see these kinds of practices unfold in ways that might be a little bit more difficult in very highly structured and regimented classrooms. The other thing just to say about this classroom is it was unique in the sense that her class consisted entirely of 8 native Spanish-speaking boys. You know, there could potentially be a whole bunch of other ideologies surrounding gender that occur within here.
Could you describe what was involved with your analysis?
Why don't I talk about the discursive aspects and you can talk about the body movements?
Yes, that would be great.
You know, we drew on a lot of work in sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology for these analyses, so it really involves some very detailed transcription of the utterances of the videotaped data. So there are a lot of sort of fancy-looking transcription conventions that are meant to enable the reader to really read it as close as possible to how it was said originally. And it also also, that same way of transcribing allows us to be able to articulate or understand when there are not only shifts in turn taking, so for example, one speaker to the next, but also shifts in the kinds of discursive conventions, a very traditional initiation response evaluation kind of a discourse to a more participatory framework, and to really look at a discursive, meaning linguistic utterance level, how the participants, the teacher and the students, were positioning one another as certain kinds of people.
We got very interested because we were looking with video, is the relationship between what kids were saying and their movements within the classroom. And we actually drew on a lot of different sources. Probably the most salient for us is the work of Bakhtin, who's a literary theorist, and he talks about the social nature of language and the dialogic interactions of meaning. And so we were very interested in how the things that kids were saying, and as they were, for example, moving in and out of groups or interacting in pairs in a smaller group, how those visual or gestural cues, if you will, were sort of lining up with what the linguistic data was saying. And we found that there were some convergences, there were some divergences, and I think for us, the field of literacy is really beginning to sort of wrestle with how do we take account of different kinds of literacies, body movements being one of them. And so we feel like this has been a real learning for us as part of this research.
I think traditionally when you look at whether it's interactional sociolinguistics or linguistic anthropology, there's a very linguistic centeredness to these kinds of analyses. And so whether it's gestures or larger body movements through space and time often takes second seat. They're viewed as supporting the utterance of what people say, right, but not the primary guiding force in how different identities and ideologies are constructed. And so what we found is that sometimes that was the case, but sometimes it was the actual, these kids jumping up from their seats and running right across the room to get dictionaries, or a kid bending over and shouting in someone's ear, that those movements are just as much, if not more so, sometimes guided the overall discourse and what was happening or being constructed in the setting.
So what, based on both the language and the body movements, were your major findings for this group of students in this setting?
We really wanted to see what was happening in this lengthy period of time in which these kids were trying to just identify one unknown word, and they spent a lot of time doing it. And so we were looking at what beyond word meanings were being constructed here. And what we found was that it's not as simple as applying one curricular approach, that there are a multitude of ideologies that are coming into play in sometimes unexpected ways. I think our findings show how these multiple ideologies were being negotiated, and in the process how different identities were being constructed, and particularly for one of the student participants. What we noted is even though he was typically positioned as not as academically astute, we actually saw him negotiating that positioning in very crafty ways. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about this is that if we can identify these moments of tactical negotiation of identities, we can actually see that there's a potential for him shifting his identity trajectory, both for academic and social identity in this interaction. And that's what is really interesting for us. I think that's a really important finding, that certain identities, how people are positioned, can be disrupted. And if we can understand that, we can perhaps support those shifts in identity.
And I think I would just add to that from a sort of professional development point of view in terms of implications. Getting teachers to look at themselves on videotapes is an old practice. But what I think is powerful about this study is potentially looking at teachers sort of analyzing themselves, working with groups of kids, and taking a look at how language and how body movements and how gestures of both teachers and students are privileging certain ways of learning, and noticing those things might help teachers take a more critical look at their own practice.
And as researchers, we are very privileged to be able to be analyzing these videotapes and watching it over and over and over. And we actually invited the teacher who has worked with us and published with us in the past to co-analyze this along with us. She ended up moving out of state, and so that was not really an option. It's easy for us to look back at the video and say, oh, well, teachers could do this and that, but in the moment, that's a much more difficult thing to identify.
Yes.
We believe that current work being done in the field, having teachers analyze video clips of their own practice, can be really helpful thing for helping identify these, what we call moments of contingency, in terms of reinforcing or challenging certain ideologies of language and literacy, contingency in terms of students' academic and social identity trajectories.
Your use of ethnography in this way of literature and body movement is a unique contribution that people should notice.
We think that integrating the linguistic discursive analyses along with the body movements is key. So there are some implications that we believe for future research in this area.
Well, thank you so much for talking about this.
Yes,
Okay.
so thank
Thanks,
you for
Trish.
Thank
talking
you.
with us.
All right.
The full citation is Handsfield and Crumpler, 2013. Dude, it's not an appropriate word. Negotiating word meeting, language ideologies and identities in a literature discussion group. Published in Linguistics and Education, Volume 24. The citation can also be found at the website coe.ilstu.edu/research/podcasts. Join us for future Research Break podcasts.
This podcast is sponsored by Illinois State University's College of Education, where we strive to assure that all students realize the democratic ideal through our teaching, research, and service to the field of education.